As I said, good evening, everybody. I'm going to do the intro tonight. So our speaker is Prof. Jansen, who completed his PhD in zoology at the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute based in UCT in 2000. His research focus in those early days was on grassland bird communities and the influence of fire and grazing intensities, particularly on game birds. He was appointed as a senior lecturer at Tshwane University of Technology in 2005 and then head of Department of Environmental Science from 2008 to 2013. In 2019, he was promoted to an associate professor, and in 2013 to a full professor. Ray started studying pangolins in the Kalahari in 2009 and established the African Pangolin Working Group in 2011. The first organization in the world focused solely on the hands-on conservation of African pangolins. Subsequently, he has published 12 scientific papers and 4 book chapters on African pangolins. He also holds a position on the IUCN Species Survival Commission Pangolin Specialist Group. He is also actively involved in intelligence operations, retrieving pangolins out of the illegal wildlife trade and law enforcement in South Africa. So I'm very pleased that he's got a little bit of spare time to join us this evening to give us this talk, because I think we all find these poor, heavily poached little creatures very fascinating, and I'm sure that you all join me in hoping that we all see one live in the bush soon. So Ray, thank you very much for joining us, and I hand over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. I think if we could, there we go. That's me, folks, and welcome tonight to my presentation on pangolins, particularly African pangolins. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen that I can. Right. So everybody should be able to see the introductory slide of the African Pangolin Working Group. As Peter said, we're a non-profit organization registered in 2013, solely for the conservation of African pangolins. We first were going to look at all 8 species of pangolins, but it was just too huge a titanic task. So we decided that we'll just focus on the African species. So tonight I'm going to give about a 40-minute presentation on the trade in African pangolins in Africa as a whole, in general, and then I'm going to focus on South Africa, but I'm also going to introduce a number of other interesting anecdotal bits of research that I undertook over the last little bit more than a decade on what pangolins are used for culturally and traditionally and in the bushmeat trade, and then sort of just give you an overview of what we as an organization are attempting to do in reversing the illegal trade in what is the most traded mammal on the planet. So I've got a very educated audience tonight, so I'm not going to go into great detail describing what a pangolin is, but if there's some younger ones watching, they're the only mammal covered in hard keratinous overlapping scales. They're often referred to as scaly anteaters. They've got no teeth, and they've got a tongue that's almost the same length of their body. It's about 2/3 the length of their body, and when it's not extracted, it's curled in a cavity below their stomach. Most are nocturnal, and there are 8 species in the world, and there are 4 in Asia, and there are 4 in Africa. And just like all mammals, the young pangolins that are termed a pangolin pup suckle from the mum for approximately, we would think, 3 to 4 months before they start foraging on solids. But this information is still brand new, and we're still learning so much about pangolin reproductive biology and parental care and distribution of young pangolins away from the nest. We thought that it's only the mum that looks after the pangolins for parental care, but we have recent video evidence of dad visiting both pangolin pup and mum in the burrows on a few occasions. Maybe not so much parental care, but just possibly having a look at how the youngster's getting along. So these unique animals, and it's their greatest downfall, are covered in these hard overlapping keratinous scales. And even a lion, a leopard, a cheetah can't break through these scales. We have found some sort of anecdotal evidence that spotted hyenas are able to break through the scales, particularly in young pangolins. We did lose a young pangolin released into the Kalahari that was predated upon by a honey badger, a rattle. But when they curl up, they grab their hind limbs with their forelimbs, and they're extremely strong animals. When you've got a big adult male pangolin in your arms, you literally can't hold that animal. It's extremely powerful, and they cannot be prized open once they're in this protective ball that they go into, which is their greatest defense. So the population in South Africa is reasonably good. The populations are highest on our border regions with Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia. This is a recent sighting in the top image between Paul Kruger and Pombeni Gates in Kruger Park, where they come out sometimes in the early morning to sun themselves, and dusk in winter when it's cool. The better chance of seeing them in the winter months. This other image was taken on the side of the road where a Temminck's pangolin crossed the N1 just south of Louis Trichardt. So we do get quite a few sightings information. So don't lose all hope, Peter. I'm sure one day you will see your live one. But just a background, where did they come from? They're such a unique bunch of creatures. How did they evolve? So early zoologists believe they belong to the order Xanatha, which is the armadillo, giant ant bears, and your sloths, simply because they look like armadillos. But in recent research that we took with one of my PhD students, they actually belong closer to the order Carnivora, in particular felids and cats. And this was a fascinating discovery because they look nothing like carnivores. They can't really open their jaws. They don't have any teeth. And it certainly doesn't look like a carnivore, although it is a predator on ants and termites. So Zelda de Toy did some groundbreaking work in her master's where she took the DNA from a number of mammals, and the cluster came out with the order Pholidota, which is the unique order of pangolins, clustering very, very closely to the Carnivora. So in the supercontinent Pangaea, around about 225 million years ago, pangolins evolved from a common ancestor, a small carnivore type animal, probably a little bit smaller than a domestic cat in what is now North America. And then they, through the supercontinent where all these, what now separated countries and continents have separated, but in those days there were land bridges between Europe and the Americas. And this animal would have evolved and then radiated out into Europe and what is now certain parts of Germany, and then later on into Asia, and then much later on into Africa. So the first true pangolins evolved around 87 million years ago. And then the African pangolins came across from Asia, first to India, and then onto the African continent. We don't know if they were tree pangolins or if they were terrestrial ground-dwelling pangolins. I suspect they were ground pangolins. And the first fossilized evidence was dug out in Germany of a pangolin that was named Eomanus. And this is the true first scaled covered keratinous pangolin from about 56 to 33.9 million years ago. So it's an ancient animal. It's got a huge evolutionary history. And there are 4 species in Africa and there are 4 species in Asia. And if you look at Pangaea and the early Gondwana, Asia, India were kind of joined to the hip of Africa on the eastern seaboard in that supercontinent. And we share a lot of common, what we term conspecific species of mammals with Asia and in particular India. The Indian elephant, African pangolin, Indian rhinos, African rhinos or Asian rhinos, Asiatic lions, which are pretty much extinct, tigers, which are very closely related to lions. But the problem is here, once you've eaten all of yours to pretty much extinction, we're seeing they're coming for ours. You get Asian perlemoen that's pretty much wiped out as well. So they're coming for our perlemoen, they're coming for our rhino, they're coming for our lion, for the lion bone trade. And they're certainly coming for elephant and ivory because of the lower availability of ivory in the Asiatic elephant species. And of course, coming for our pangolins in huge numbers. So if I focus on African pangolins, the Temminck's pangolin, it used to be called the Temminck's ground pangolin. We've taken out the descriptive middle word ground. And the giant ground pangolin are the two terrestrial ground-dwelling pangolin species. The Temminck's has got the largest distributional range from South Africa all along the eastern seaboard right up to northern part of Chad. And then the giant ground pangolin, which is a huge animal, up to 35, 40 kilograms. It's just a massively powerful animal. But the Temminck's pangolin is the only species of pangolin which is bipedal. So theoretically, it's got two arms and it's got two legs, where the other pangolins are quadrupeds. So they've all got four legs. And then you got the two little guys, the charismatic, beautiful little black-bellied tree pangolin, which is arboreal tree dwelling, and the white-bellied tree pangolin, which is also arboreal but comes down more often than the black-bellied tree pangolin, which comes down very rarely to ground. They're only about 2 to 2.5 kilograms, so they're very small little tropical pangolins. The giant ground pangolin is extremely rare and it's highly traded. More prominent in the central parts of Africa. Countries such as Uganda is probably the best place to see them. So where you want to go and look at the gorillas, the mountain gorillas, it's probably the best place you'll find a giant ground pangolin. I've never had the privilege of seeing one of those. So the Temminck's pangolin in South Africa is classified as vulnerable according to the IUCN list of endangered species, and it occurs on our bushveld border regions with Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, and then in also your more arid regions in the southwest parts of Botswana and also Namibia, which is probably your best place to see them because you can actually see their tracks in the soft Kalahari sand. So electric fences are probably responsible for more pangolin deaths in southern Africa than the trade currently. Darren Peterson did his master's with me, wrote up a paper that we have just over 13,000 kilometers of electric fences, primarily in the game ranching industry. And the mortality ranges between sort of 400 and 1,100 pangolins estimated that die every year because of the bottom lower strand of these electric fences. And most of you at Sandparks Honorary Ranges know exactly what it looks like. And it's either to keep certain predators out or it's to keep certain animals in. But that because they're bipedal, that bottom strand is at the perfect height that it touches its very soft skin on its underbelly. And the first bolt comes through and it curls around that bottom strand to protect itself. And 10 seconds or 12 seconds later, the next, as it's about to uncurl, the next bolt comes through. And about half an hour of that, and unfortunately, we lose them. So these are very urgent projects that we need to attend to try and reverse the decline of these pangolins. But I would also like to chat about the harvest and use of pangolins generally in Africa, because it's got perspective on what's happening in our country, and it all relates together in a puzzle. And I'm going to try and put that puzzle together for you tonight. So pangolins are used in Southern Africa for cultural purposes, but not so much for protein or bushmeat purposes. Abin Bolo was my master's student who went and investigated and interviewed 343 people, ranging from tribal leaders to traditional healers to just people locally on the ground, whether they've seen pangolins, when last they've seen pangolins, what they believe the pangolin can be used for. Is it a spiritual belief? Is it a medicinal belief? Because this is important, because pangolins are seen as culturally very significant, spiritual, important animals, like other species used in cultural medicine. For example, vultures, lion feet, lion claws, crocodile skulls, that type of thing. So we wanted to know, are they harvested? At what levels are they harvested? And what are the cultural belief systems associated with the species? Because you can't manage a species unless you understand the offtake levels and its protection status within local communities. And she investigated tribal people belonging to Sepedi, Zulu, Tsonga, Venda, Tswana, Siswati, and Ndebele people. And if you look at 27% of the people interviewed, the respondents, how many had actually recently seen a pangolin? And if you think about how many of you out there have seen a pangolin, that's actually quite a high number. And the Venda people, followed by the Sepedi and the Tswana people, and the Tsonga, had seen most of them. And if you look at the distribution of those cultural peoples, they're all in the northern parts of South Africa. So the borders with Botswana, borders with up with the Venda people, with Zimbabwe, Kruger Park region, and certain parts of Mozambique. That's where they had been seen most frequently, which overlaps with the distributional range and where we know the numbers are reasonably good. Spiritual uses, they all pretty much believe that they protect you from evil spirits. So they take the scale, they grind it into a powder, and they make cuts on their arm, and you grind the sort of paste you make into these cuts, and you're protected from evil spirits. They also put the ground scale into cement to build a house, into mud to build a kraal, but they also used in a huge range of medicinal so-called cures, ranging from nosebleeds to rheumatism to liver cancer to boils and cracked heels, and so lots of different uses, a huge cultural significance. But the point that I need to emphasize here is one scale can be used over even 6-7 months by a traditional healer. One skin would last a whole community more than a decade. So the harvest is reasonably sustainable. Pangolins are run over by cars, they're picked up on electric fences. Not all of them are simply killed for cultural and traditional use in South Africa. And certainly the same seems to be in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So the important part of the study is that the offtake and the harvest by people traditionally in this country was and is very low. For the Shona people in Zimbabwe and the Zulu people in South Africa, pangolins is probably one of the greatest gifts you can bestow upon a tribal leader. And tribal leaders like Robert Mugabe were known to be given many hundreds of pangolins in his inauguration. Now, pangolins in Zululand are pretty much locally ecologically extinct. I say ecologically extinct because there's no recruitment via natural reproduction. You may find a few spotted here and there individually, but their recruitment to natural population is on a negative decline. So they're locally ecologically extinct. We are busy with a project now with a number of private reserves and provincial reserves reintroducing pangolins back into Zululand, and it's extremely exciting. We've just got over a dozen animals released down there. But this is work that we have to deal with communities in enlightening them and creating a protection status for cultural communities. So those are some of the threats. But what about the trade in Central and West Africa, the bushmeat trade in pangolins? What's happening there? Because is it going to move south? So we need to understand the greater part of the continent south of the Sahara to manage pangolins in general. So I had a PhD student, Maxwell, that went up to Sierra Leone and went up to Ghana and spent about 3 years looking at the bushmeat trade and looking at the cultural significance and use of particularly the two tree dwelling species of pangolins in that part of West Africa. And that map on the left-hand side is interesting in that those lightly shaded green areas are actually formally protected areas. The picture on the top right-hand side is actually a photograph through one of those protected areas. So when we think of the Kruger Park and our reserves in this country, even the Karoo National Park or Grabie's or whatever, it's pretty much protected by a huge fence. There's access gate guards. Well, this is what those parks look like. Apparently that road is in reasonably good condition, but that is easy and free access to your protected areas. If you look at the graph at the bottom left, that's the abundance of pangolins that are available for sale as you move away from one of those green areas. So when you reach 20 kilometers, there are no more pangolins, fresh pangolins that are sold on the side of the road. Like you can see in the bottom right-hand figure, those are living white-bellied tree pangolins for sale for around about $20 US each. So it tells us that these pangolins are now being harvested out of the remaining protected areas because they're not harvested, they're not available for more than 20 kilometers from these protected areas. It also tells us that the pangolins are no longer free roaming and available in the non-protected areas, the paler areas in those maps, which is quite disconcerting. So during the rainy season, these guys are farmers. They farm in cocoa, they farm in palm oil, or whatever the crop happens to be. Outside of the growing season, they become hunters. So we don't call them poachers because this is what they've kind of been doing for the last hundreds or thousands of years. Outside of the agricultural season, they go and access bushmeat, and 70 to 80% of the population in Central and West Africa, their primary source of protein is actually bushmeat and not commercial livestock as we find in Southern Africa. So this is fresh produce sold on the side of the road, and there's a whole commodity chain how these animals are moved from these rural areas into more central, large urban cities. And there these chaps who are more well off have freezers, and the pangolins become freely available. So we also investigated whether they had some cultural significance. And just like in South Africa and Southern Africa in general, pangolins do have a cultural significance in both Ghana and Sierra Leone. Their body parts, which was interesting because a lot of fresh body parts were used for certain cure of certain ailments, not just the scales, but they were used in cultural practices, not only spiritual practices, but certainly to treat certain specific remedies, which we didn't know existed. But this series of slides is somewhat disturbing, but it is important. So apologies for the youngsters that are on view tonight, but it's important to understand what's going on. So pangolins are killed once they're harvested. They're boiled for about 2 to 3 minutes to soften up the scales. They're descaled, they're eviscerated, they're cooked on open fires, and that's how they're sold. The image on the right of the pile of scales lying on an open sack is got huge significance because it's a byproduct, it's a waste product. It had no real value besides the odd ailment cure or spiritual remedy, but they'd use very little for that. But we've seen in recent years how Asia, in particular China, has moved into the African continent primarily to mine our wealth of mineral resources. And these Asian people would come across this pile of discarded scales as a result of the bushmeat trade, and would obviously ask, you know, the bushmeat trader, what are you using those for? Can I have them? And it would be obvious that the guy had a waste product and he would just say, help yourself. But then he would say to the chap, well, would you give me something for them? And he would say, well, I'll give you $20, $30 for that little pile. And in time, and very recently, I would say the last 4 to 5 years, the commodity chain has completely spun on its back. And these scales are now worth actually more than the pangolin meat itself. So we find a huge movement now of these bushmeat traders actively hunting pangolins for the illicit international wildlife trade from Africa to Asia. And this is extremely concerning because this used to be a waste product, and pangolins were sold as a sort of an affluent meat dish to local people in Central and West Africa. But now they are being actively hunted for their scales. And we're seeing huge, huge shipments, like the photograph on the bottom left, of tons and tons of pangolin scales moving out of Africa to Asia. We're seeing images like this taken in places such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, China, of huge volumes of Asian pangolins that are harvested and intercepted in the trade. In more recent years, we're seeing a lot less of these images because these are Asian pangolins and now they're being replaced by African species. So the Asian species are becoming harder and harder to source. They're becoming more difficult to source. They're becoming more expensive to source. African pangolins are simply a much, much easier solution. They are reasonably easily available if you put a reward out for them. And they're reasonably cheap compared to the Chinese or Asian species. This is a typical traditional pharmacopoeia shop in Hong Kong in mainland China. Now, the problem with cultural belief system, it is a type of religion and it's ancient. And I've got writings that go back to the northern and southern dynasties of 420 AD. And in more recent times, they were used for the treatment of more clinical applications for medical ailments. But it's a very ancient culture, and it's a culture just like a religion. And you can start a world war if you take away people's culture, you take away people's religion. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to do. The problem is that a lot of the local people don't know that pangolin scales are a particular part or a remedy in this cultural medicine. I have estimated that there's 60 different cultural remedy products for sale, commercially packaged by factories in mainland China. And each one of those is used to treat very specific ailments, whether they're spiritual or medical ailments. The people don't know there are pangolins in there, but they won't stop buying those particular commercial remedies because they'd be using it for many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And this is one of the fundamental problems we're sitting with. Pangolins are also freely available on the internet. You can just Google them and you'll find pangolin scales for sale. A lot of them are phishing scams. In other words, you pay the money up front and you never get anything, but a lot of them are not. But they're certainly available all over the world, in North America, Canada, certain parts of Europe, even parts of Indonesia and Australia and New Zealand, where people from Africa or from Asia have migrated to other parts of the world. We have to bear in mind that they take their culture with them and they won't stop their cultural uses. So if we look at global uses of pangolins, it's very rare, but we do find pangolins in fashion, certainly in North America in cowboy boots, certainly in parts of Europe to make ornamental dresses, but the large majority are for cultural medicine in Asia. In certain parts of Vietnam, pangolin fetus soup is highly sought after, and you're paying about $350 a kilogram, but you have to pay for the entire animal. So that value of $1,750 is somewhat outdated. It's closer to $2,500 for that particular dish. So we're talking about a huge amount of money. Trade routes off the eastern seaboard of Africa, out of Mombasa, from Kenya, also from Maputo in Mozambique, more recently from Richards Bay, Durban, and Cape Town harbors, we've intercepted scales. The large majority of pangolins are traded out of Central Africa, but more importantly, in the Gulf of Guinea, in particular Nigeria, which is responsible for up to 70% of the pangolins traded out of Africa. So if we look at some of the statistics I've been putting together for just under a decade, the trade has increased literally exponentially, and it peaked in 2019 with 97 tons of African pangolin scales intercepted off the African continent. Bear in mind that we only intercept 10 to 15% of the actual trade. That means that 85 to 90% goes undetected. So what does 97 tons of scales equate to? It's approximately around about 150 to 160,000 pangolins in 1 year. So if we're only intercepting 10%, then we're actually looking at over 1 million pangolins being harvested and exported in terms of scales every single year. If you look at the graphic on the bottom right-hand side, last year with the pandemic, the trade literally collapsed. It flatlined when the pandemic hit the world at the end of February 2020. However, that's when we closed the trade routes. That's when we closed the borders. That's when we closed the airports. That's when we closed the harbors. So they couldn't move the scales. It doesn't mean they weren't harvesting them. They were most certainly harvesting them. And I've got very good intel of stockpiles in countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon, and then also in Vietnam. So if we look at the source of these pangolin scales from Africa, Nigeria is the greatest culprit. It's not solely responsible for Nigerian pangolins. It collects pangolin scales from all over the Gulf of Guinea. And then it comes to a central point in Nigeria, and then it's shipped out to the rest of the world. We've also seen high levels in the DRC, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast. Most exports, the large majority is to China, Singapore, Vietnam, and Malaysia. But that's not unique to Central and West Africa. We are dealing with an increasing scourge in the illegal wildlife trade of pangolins in South Africa. And we're seeing this increasing year on year and on year. And in 2019, the National Prosecuting Authority released a statement saying that pangolins are now the mammal that is most increased in trade in this country. It isn't the mammal that is traded the most, it's the most increased mammal in trade, which is a significant statement coming from the government. So law enforcement in this country, this is Umqombothi. Umqombothi is the African name given to cultural African beer. And Umqombothi was retrieved out of this drum in Benoni in June 2018 in Gauteng, where the drum was still a third full of Umqombothi beer. The last time that I saw Umqombothi, we were tracking her with a fixed-wing aircraft over the Klaseri, but she was doing exceptionally well, and she was just hauling ass towards the central part of the Kruger Park, which was just wonderful. This is how we receive intel from the trade. So I communicate with these guys and I say, I want a video, I want a time, I want a date, I want evidence you've got the animal. And then we start normally of a WhatsApp conversation. And this is typically of an intelligence operation and verifying that they do indeed have the animal, because we have to be very, very careful. These intelligence-driven sting operations could be traps and it could be an ambush. And the act on the right is a 252A statement that once I've verified this, I go through the police units I work with and we apply to the National Prosecuting Authority for an entrapment procedure that we lawfully allowed to carry on a sting operation. If we don't do this, we can lose the case because the defense argues that we've trapped the person and we've gone against their human rights. So it's an important process that we have to follow. This is camera footage from a sting operation I pulled off not far from my house, which my wife wasn't very chuffed about. But when I put my hands on my head, it is a signal to the units that are hiding away that I've got eyes on the pangolin. The suspects are in that white Corsa bucky. And I'll just play the video. So there we go. I've just seen it and all hell breaks loose. So this particular individual pangolin had already deceased, but I still wanted to catch the suspect. So it's important that we retrieve the pangolin out the trade and we put them into custody and we make sure that the law runs its course. So has the pandemic impacted in South Africa? We can see sort of over the last 5-6 years, there's some trade data increasing very rapidly with a peak in 2018. 2019, 36 animals, but 2020, even more during the pandemic than the previous year. So we've seen, as with other wildlife, there's been a huge knock-on as people have lost their jobs, bringing income and revenue into their households, turning to crime, and wildlife crime is no exempt. So during the pandemic, we actually had a huge number of pangolins retrieved out of the illegal wildlife trade in this country. Limpopo had the large majority of pangolins retrieved, followed by Gauteng, and then in Mpumalanga province, Northwest province, a few in KZN. We're seeing increased trade in the Northern Cape coming from Namibia and a few cases in the Western Cape, in particular Cape Town. Interesting that October, over all of these 4 years that I analyzed the data I have, was the peak in the trade. It's almost time, you know, that people are getting ready for Christmas and want to make money. We're not 100% sure what it is. There's no difference between sex of pangolins, male or female. There's no increase in juveniles. There's no significant change in the dynamics of which pangolins are traded. Pangolin movement doesn't significantly differ between months of the year. So it's something that we need to actually ask these guys that we catch, why is this peak in October? So we kind of dread October. The Johannesburg Wildlife Hospital, which are our close partners that work with pangolins, and they go to an ICU environment, at one stage had 10 pangolins that they were treating, which is an incredibly stressful situation. If we look at the number of arrests, we've arrested 267 people over the last 4 years. This photograph of the chap on the left that I arrested in Johannesburg, just off the R21 at the Shell Ultra City, actually had his young 3 or 4 year old boy in the car. And we didn't even know he was there until one of the police guys found him crying. So it's a very difficult, humane and inhumane situation where you're dealing with real people, but you're also dealing with real pangolins, real trade, and real poaching. So court cases is an interesting scenario. Prior to 2016, we didn't attend court cases, and court case findings and sentencing was a 500 Rand fine, a 1,000 Rand fine, a suspended sentence fine. So we attend every single court case we can, whether it's in Khayelitsha, whether it's in Musina, whether it's in Polokwane, it doesn't matter, to provide testimony in aggravation of sentencing, to explain to the magistrate, to explain to the prosecuting attorney what this is all about, what this animal is all about, what the law says. And the law says 10 years in jail or 10 million Rand fine or both. And once we've kind of explained this in aggravation, we're getting better and better sentences. And this year and last year, we got collectively 3 8-year sentences. But we started off slowly, and slowly we're setting a precedent, and slowly we're starting to win this fight. The large majority of suspects come from Zimbabwe, even more than 70%, and then Mozambique and Botswana and Namibia. And we tell the courts, you can't give bail, because this is what we see when we give bail. These guys hop over the fence and you never ever see them again. This is just some stats from 2018 of where we did these intelligence operations. A few in Northwest, large majority in Limpopo and Mpumalanga, and Gauteng's a hotspot. This correlates to hotspots of migrant labor into the farm areas bordering the private parks, the APNR next to the Kruger Park, also into your large settlement areas like Bushbuck Ridge, down into Nelspruit, and then into Gauteng. There's a close correlation between migrant labor and pangolin trade. And over the last number of years, we've probably got, I would say, the most efficient pangolin task team out of any country in the world. They're members of the South African Police Service, different units, K9 units, endangered stocks theft units, crime intelligence units, and then also from the Directorate of Priority Crimes Investigation, the Hawks, and then also from the Environmental Management Inspectorate from Gauteng, from Limpopo, from Mpumalanga, known as the Green Scorpions. We've developed our own counter-poaching K9 unit, where we've got now a young Dutch Shepherd being trained on the scent of all 4 species of African pangolins. And then all the pangolins are delivered to an off-site facility at the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital. If they are retrieved out of the trade in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga, there are veterinary surgeons that have come for training at the hospital that can provide immediate intensive care before it's shipped to the hospital. So we have a very close, strong working relationship with this hospital that are in their own right, their own non-profit organization, and are probably the finest pangolin veterinary hospital led by Dr. Corinne Lawrence and Nikki Wright, who is also one of my founding executive directors of the AP, African Pangolin Working Group. So these pangolins are in the best possible care they can be anywhere in the world. And we've learned so much from their medical treatment over the last number of years. The Temminck's pangolin doesn't feed in captivity. So we've got volunteers that help in the surrounding areas where they travel to actually walk with pangolins, where they can feed naturally, because they don't feed in captivity. They aren't offered food while with their captors or water. They come out emaciated, stressed, dehydrated, compromised, physically compromised, mentally, and they eat huge volumes of ants. And it's critically important that they put on body weight before they can be discharged from the hospital. And then they come back into our care. We've got a number of release sites in Zululand We've got a number of release sites in Limpopo province. They're on large reserves in excess of 10,000 hectares, and they're overseen by release teams, highly dedicated teams that monitor these pangolins on the ground. And this release site data is critically important because we were shocked back in 2016 that we thought we were doing everything right. We were saving them from the trade. The hospital was treating them in an ICU environment. They got back to their health, but they weren't making it. Just as 2018 trade, which turned our understanding on our head, we treated 37 pangolins, 27% died, 24% died following release, 32% we lost VHF telemetry signal. At that time, we were only monitoring still 2. There was 1 under rehab, and 3 we don't know what happened. And for an endangered species such as the Temix pangolin, we can't afford to do this. We can't afford to lose any of them. Now, we only release pangolins that are over 6.5 kilograms. They're fitted with both a VHF transmitter as well as a satellite transmitter. They go into a facilitated soft release program where they get accustomed to sights, sounds, their handlers, their dens. Is the food available? Is the food the right food? Because a Mozambique pangolin may not eat the same food as a pangolin that was poached in Zimbabwe. They're monitored for at least twice a day for the first 3 weeks, and then twice a week for the next 3 months, and then at least once a week for the following 3 months, and even up to a year. We found pangolins collapsed in the veld after 3 months where pneumonia has returned in the cold spell that they picked up in the trade. And our success has now increased to above 85%. And Francois Meyer has just completed his MSc through the University of Venda, specifically focusing on the distribution and survival of these pangolins that are released out of the illegal wildlife trade in South Africa. And he's doing his PhD on a similar topic, just more intense now. And Francois found that there was a 12% increase in survival if we follow this facilitated soft release. We don't just dump them into the new area and they just have to adapt or die. We assist them, we help them, we weigh them. It's very important they put on weight during their release process. It's important that we monitor their health. So we do disturb them in the first couple of weeks, but then we back off as time goes by. And interestingly enough, if you look at the scale at the bottom left there, that's the home range or the distribution of a pangolin over a couple of weeks. You're looking at 30 to 40 kilometers over a few days. So release sites have to be large. We have to speak to the farmers. We have to monitor electric fences. We need to make sure the surrounding farms are also happy that our monitoring team. The one on the right is probably not as extreme, but these are 2 female adult pangolins. They walk for huge lengths of time and overcover large distances, sometimes 10, 12 kilometers in one night, traversing electric fence, traversing tar roads. So these post-release monitoring protocols are really, really important, and they need to be in place. Unfortunately, they require huge amounts of time. They require effort. They require a buy-in from the landowners. We require teams on the ground, but we've got wonderful, wonderful people that we're working with, and they require a huge amount of money because we don't get any funding from the government. So we do beg and plead as much as we can, but we're doing okay. And I think we're making a huge difference. And that's my presentation tonight. Folks, I'm going to stop the share and then ask Peter to take over.
Ray, thank you very much. That was fascinating. It was, you've raised my hopes that maybe one day I'll come and join you and you'll show me one of these little creatures running around in the bush. Okay, we've got questions. I'm just going to switch my video off because otherwise I'll loom over everybody as I try and read the questions. So let me go through the questions for you. Right. From Jansen Davies, since many of us have not seen pangolins in the wild and they are secretive, how come so many are poached to make up the tons of scales confiscated worldwide?
Yeah, it's a very good question because it's a question that asked quite frequently because it's quite important. So the tree-dwelling pangolins in Central or West Africa are reasonably abundant. And these chaps spend a large amount of money in those, a lot amount of time in those tropical forests because they're already sourcing bushmeat trade. So they are easily sourced. We know that they do use dogs to source them as well. But when you have been hunting these animals for most of your life, and now there's a bounty on their head for even up to 100, 200 US dollars, I think the effort you're going to put into sourcing them is going to quadruple, and you're going to find them quite easily. In the southern part of Africa, in South Africa, we found that they've also trained local dogs to scent out wild pangolins. You also get these young herd chaps that look after cattle and goats. They spend 12 hours in the bush with their goats and cattle every day. Pangolins are held in high esteem, so you're actually not allowed to pick one up culturally, just take it off the field. But when you offer that young chap a couple of £100, and pangolins are very, very territorial, they've got their favorite burrows, and you put the word out that there's a reward on these animals, they're reasonably easy to source, certainly where there's money involved.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Our next question, which was an emailed one from Darlene. If a scale is damaged on a pangolin, does it regrow a new scale? Or?
No. So the pangolin scales are pretty much the same as fingernails. They don't grow very rapidly, but they certainly do get worn with time. And as they get worn, they certainly get sharp. And if you're dealing with an angry pangolin and it slashes its tail out, it will draw blood. And it's an extremely long, strong fifth appendage. But as time goes by and as the scales wear down and the growth point of the scale is active, it's an active growth point, eventually that pangolin scale will grow out into a fresh, reasonably new scale. But they're very, very hard on their scales. They sometimes use rocky caves as sleeping quarters, and they really batter those scales, but it doesn't seem to harm them at all. The adult pangolins have much thicker scales, so you can almost estimate the age of a pangolin by the not only the weight of the animal itself, but the thickness and the strength of those scales.
Great, thank you. A question from Glenn Thompson. With regards to electric fences, is there something that can be done or addressed by sand parks and the ALPN, etc., to remove bottom strands to save pangolins from being electrocuted?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Glenn is our counter-poaching manager. One of the problems with electric fences is those designs have pretty much been gazetted and accepted by government as a set standard. As far as I know, you may be able to lift them slightly up or slightly down, but we have to put together a research project where we have a certain length of electric fence, and that must be a significant length, and we either drop the bottom strand lower, or we elevate it higher, or we have some sort of mechanism where we're automatically allowed to switch off the electric current that the animal can free itself. But to do all of that, we have to prove it works. And not only do we need to prove it works, we also need to prove that it can still keep out the animals that the game farmer or whatever wanted to keep out, or keep the animals in. So it requires an experimental period. Now, the problem with pangolins are they are not like scrub hares. There's not one around every corner. So how do you test a significant length of fence, probably 100 kilometers, with a significant number of pangolins that are ghosts? They're unicorns. You don't see them. You can't find them. So it's an incredibly difficult problem that we need to address.
Great, thank you. A very current one from Michelle Lambertio. What is your opinion about blaming this animal for the COVID-19 virus? You knew that was coming.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, because in the 2003-2002 severe acute respiratory syndrome SARS outbreak, civet cats in Asia were blamed, and there was a huge onslaught on civet cats to try and eradicate that particular SARS outbreak. We are extremely concerned that a similar vindictive behavior will occur if pangolins are blamed for the current SARS outbreak of COVID-19. So the smoking gun has never been found. The smoking gun will never be found. I believe it was a once-off event where it was a mutated SARS virus from a horseshoe bat and very likely infected an Asian pangolin species, probably a Sunda pangolin. The virus mutated in transferring to the pangolin, and it again mutated in transferring to humans. But we need to be very careful in saying that was indeed the case. As it stands now, the jury is out, but I would not like to publicly say that pangolins were the cause of one of the greatest pandemics. But I would like to say that abusing our natural wildlife to the benefit of man is our own undoing. And I think we need to start realizing that the inhumane activities that we are currently undertaking on this planet need to change.
Great answer, Ray. Thank you. I've got to agree with that one. Penelope Brown, what are the scales made of, and do they have any proven pharmaceutical properties?
Penelope, yeah, very, very good question, because the scales are made up of keratin, so you may as well take a bite out of your fingernail and you get exactly the same chemistry into your body. However, we need to prove this scientifically, and I haven't read a paper that has looked at all the chemical components of various species of pangolins, but I believe that the same answer will come out. It's a placebo effect. So if you give somebody a Smartie and say it'll take away your stomach ache, and you really, really believe that the brain is a hugely powerful machine, I think your stomach ache will disappear. So personally, it has got no proven pharmaceutical or pharmacopoeia value, and it's simply something that you perceive works, but there's no scientific evidence to indicate otherwise.
Thanks. I'm going to combine two questions from Phil Strauss. I know you've partially answered them during the talk. Did COVID-19 have any impact on the numbers harvested and traded? And is it your experience that illegal immigrants are the largest numbers who do the poaching in South Africa as opposed to South Africans?
Yes, 100%. So the large majority of trade in pangolins in this country would be from migrant labor. Many of those are illegal immigrants from neighboring countries. Within countries' borders themselves, the amount of trade has not decreased. Within global trade, it has flatlined. In other words, it's literally collapsed between countries, but more importantly, between continents. We see pangolin trade from Africa to North America, from Africa to Europe, from Africa to Asia. This has literally collapsed last year at the end of February. But we need to bear in mind that shipping routes are now open. Shelves are empty. Trade routes are flooded. They're flooded with large volumes of stock that need to go back onto empty shelves. It's going to be a hell of a lot easier to put smuggled pangolin scales in amongst this huge flood of cargo leaving airports and leaving harbors, and it's going to become more difficult to monitor and to detect. So I believe we're going to see a huge onslaught in trade again within the next couple of months. We've already seen 4 tons of scales being shipped out of Africa in the last couple of weeks. So I don't think it's stopped, and I don't think it's going to stop.
Scary answer. Okay, this one's not a question, it's a compliment, but I'll just slip it in the middle. This is from Francois Kloppers down in the Cape. Just a great thank you to you, Ray, for a brilliant webinar. Your passion clearly shows in your presentation. Please never give up.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Francois. I'll buy you a beer when I'm next in the Cape.
Okay, two questions, one from Darius and Richard. They're both basically the same. What are the best procedures to follow if a live poached pangolin is happened upon?
Yeah, thank you for that. So the public are the point of the spear in combating this trade. There isn't one incident I can think of that we didn't get the intel from the public. Just a general person, whether they're living in Bryanston or living on a farm near Bronkhorstspruit or living on the outskirts of White River. It's always the public. Within each region, you've got the South African Police Service Stock Theft and Endangered Species Unit. If you don't have their contacts, you can simply contact the nearest police station, because they have then the mandate to deliver that case over to these endangered species stock theft units. I work with every single one of those in the whole country. So collectively, we will make a plan to launch an operation to retrieve that pangolin out of whatever part of the country you're in.
Great, thank you. Right, a question from Christine. Do insecticides affect pangolins? And if so, do we know how many we lose each year?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Also a very good question. Pesticides most certainly do affect pangolins. They have been known to kill pangolins outright. Even if insecticides are sprayed in close vicinity of a pangolin, they're very, very, very sensitive. But those medical answers, I don't have all of them, but they could be directed to the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital via email. But certainly they are extremely sensitive, and they're very similar to how you would treat a cat, although I'm not going to say that's how you would do it. But if you would treat a dog with certain medicine, you won't treat a cat with the same medicine. So cats are also very, very sensitive, and pangolins are indeed that. But we've learned a huge amount over the last 5-6 years since the hospital has become established on how to treat pangolins, and it's been hugely successful.
A quick one that just popped up on the chat room. The Pangolin Africa WhatsApp group, is that your group or is that somebody else?
No. So Pangolin Africa were one of the supporters and sponsors of that very good documentary made by Bruce Young about the eye of the pangolin. And Pangolin Africa, following that documentary, launched their own non-profit organization that put out a WhatsApp group, that information that is pertaining to pangolins of the illegal trade, that would be a cell phone number WhatsApp group, which they would then pass on to law enforcement. But they're not a part of the African Pangolin Working Group.
Okay, so there's somebody that if somebody found a pangolin wandering down the street, they could get that group. And yeah,
sure.
just to sort of go back to that, I can't tell you the results of the story, but a few years ago, the son of a friend of ours was driving through Melrose late at night and saw a pangolin wandering down the road, phoned his parents, and they said, "You've had too much to drink, come home immediately." But anyway, it genuinely was one which had escaped from somebody who'd had it. Correct. And they got it to a vet, but I don't know what happened to it afterwards, unfortunately. Okay. Another question.
Maybe I could just elaborate quickly there, Peter. They're unusual, uncanny escape artists, incredibly intelligent. And we've retrieved 3 from the public walking down the Joburg streets. And so, you know, one of their saviors, they're able to escape out of small little windows high up in walls. So phenomenal intelligence, actually.
Great, thank you. All right, a question from David. How does one determine the difference between a pangolin digging and an aardvark digging?
Pangolin diggings are very localized. So they would use their middle claw, which is the longest and most powerful claw, just to slightly pry open an ant nest. Many ant nests aren't termitaria, so they're not elevated off the ground in a round structure. They're simply a hole in the ground. And often those ants are sourced in those nests. We found in a number of cases that termites are not the favorite food type, but we have had pangolins that would literally excavate an entire termitaria and dig from one side to the other. But the scratchings for the ants are very small and localized, whereas aardvark may be more significant and robust. But there's not 100% method to distinguish between the 2 species, although pangolins love to dig right into the termitaria, and often when they've got a full belly, actually sleep inside that earthy, warm, comfortable termitaria. So the excavations are often sometimes even bigger than aardvark.
Okay. A question, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Mobo Laji. He says, you're doing fantastic work going after criminals. He wants to know whether you investigate further and try and find the dons behind the illegal trade rather than the individual people.
Yeah, very good question, Mobology. It's one of the things that we're lacking is to infiltrate these syndicates. We have not been successful. That tells me that they're becoming more and more organized crime, and to infiltrate them is absolutely critical, because it's often the very destitute, poor guy that ends up actually harvesting the pangolin out of the bush. We've seen it in the rhino horn trade. We've seen it in these Mozambicans that come into the Kruger Park, been offered large volumes of money. And we've seen again and again that their households are destitute, and these guys don't have work, and they revert to crime, and a lot of that is wildlife crime. The actual head of the snake is the organized syndicates, and that is a really crucial step we need to focus on. And we are working with Sandparks Intelligence, which they have offices in Pretoria. We are working with the Hawks, and we're working with the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries in mechanisms to try and infiltrate this very critical part of the trade.
Great, thank you. I'm going to sort of try and speed up a little bit here. The questions are rolling in. From Afua, given the alarming rate that pangolins are being removed from the wild, do you think the IUCN status of threatened should be revised to draw attention to their plight?
Yes, so all 8 species have got a different threatened status. The Chinese pangolin is critically endangered. We've just uplisted the giant ground pangolin as well as the white-bellied pangolin. The Temix pangolin is vulnerable, which is one of the lower statuses out of the 8 species of pangolin, simply because, and I was part of the review process amongst other authors, also members of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Pangolin Specialist Group. The Temix pangolin numbers are still reasonable. I don't think they need an uplisting at this stage. However, in saying that, if the trade continues unabated at the extent and level that it is now, we are shortly going to experience, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, an increase in the status of the pangolin, possibly up to near threatened and then critical. But for now, I'm happy to say that we feel the populations around Kruger area and the northern parts of South Africa and in regions such as the Soutpansberg are still reasonably good. In saying that, we don't release pangolins into areas where their population is reasonable, because 2 male pangolins are highly territorial and they can kill one another.
They don't have teeth. How do they kill one another?
They donner into each other like 2 buses coming headstream. So those sharpened edge of their scales for an adult male, the edges are very sharp because they get worn down on rocks and such. They actually push those scales under the scales of its opponent and incinerate lacerations that become infected. And after a couple of days, they can die from various infections or loss of blood or whatever it happens to be.
Okay, thanks. A question that's come from the Facebook one from Yanka. Please may I ask, what is their reproduction rate, and do they ever have multiple offspring?
Yeah, thanks, Yanka. So one female pangolin would have 1 pup per year. We still, the reproductive biology is in its infancy. We feel it may only be 1 pup every 2 years, but as it stands, it's 1 pup every year, where pup stays with mom for anywhere from about 6 to 8 months. So the recruitment to the natural population is very low. And when you're dealing with an animal that's got low recruitment to its natural population and the harvest exceeds recruitment, you're going to have a population decline. And this is what we're very concerned about. So we still need to know a lot about their reproductive biology. Was there another part to that question, Peter?
No, that was it.
Okay.
Okay. Here's an interesting thing about how modern technology helps us. This is from Nikki Wright. She says, the Melrose pangolin was indeed rescued, draped in a pool net, and brought through to me years ago. It was treated and released in the Waterberg.
Thanks for that, Nikki. Nikki's my executive director, and she keeps me out of trouble most of the time.
Okay. Right. Jansen Davies says, what is Darren Peterson doing at the moment, and how can we help APWG?
I'd prefer not to comment on what Darren's doing at the moment, but if you guys want to help us, then, you know, one of our greatest weapons is the support of the public. As I said previously, we get all these pangolins out of intelligence from the public. So spread the word to your children, spread the word via social media, which is probably our greatest weapon. And that in itself, it just enlightening the youth and enlightening the people and enlightening your workforce. Maybe you've got a company, you know, just put on an email that if you see this animal that's been offered for sale, let us know or let the police know. But information technology and social media is a really, really powerful weapon.
Okay. All right, I'm sort of combining a couple of thoughts that people have put up here. You know, there are quite a few, I know EWT and various groups do them, where they ask the public to report sightings. Would it help you if people reported sightings of pangolins, if they were somewhere and they saw a pangolin? You know, I mean, not in the wild I'm talking about.
Sure. It's very important because we wouldn't be able to infer their distribution, and we wouldn't be able to infer where they still occur naturally and locally. So that's really important. We've got a report sighting button on our webpage. Folks can also, on our webpage, or my personal details, if they don't want to go through that, WhatsApp me, email me, SMS me, but we populate that database regularly. And when we do a review of the endangered species status of pangolins for the South African government, we make use of that database to determine when last pangolins were seen in what parts of the country and how frequently. So really, really important for the public to send through that information to us.
Great, thank you. Another question from Penelope Brown. What measures are there recountering or educating the Asian market, and what regulations exist in these countries?
Yeah, in recent months, the Chinese pangolin has been upgraded to the greatest conservation status in China, and that's the same level as the panda, which the Chinese people hold very dear. So we're extremely grateful for that upgrade in the conservation status. They've also removed the use of pangolin scales and other pangolin body parts in cultural Asian pharmacopoeia in China, which was a wonderful step in the right direction. However, there are loopholes in that those products that are patented may still be traded legally. And that loophole has now resulted in everybody trying to use patented pangolins. So that needs to be taken off the shelf as well. Our greatest weapon is educating the youth. And if you need to change a person's perception to alter their cultural belief system, you need to speak to the youth and you need to enlighten the youth. The problem is we don't have 2 decades to do this. If we leave it for 2 decades, we can lose all 8 species of pangolin. So we definitely need more support from people such as China. And more recently, we've had even more support from the Vietnamese government that is offering a higher protection status for pangolins in Vietnam that we really are very, very grateful for.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that they are slowly changing the laws and making it more difficult there. This is not really a question. This is from Beverly Elliott. She's read that the Chinese don't care if something becomes extinct because the value goes up because of the rarity. I'd just like to say something that's always stuck in my mind when a similar question was asked about rhino horn, and the person answered it to say, poaching will stop when a live rhino is worth more than a dead one. And I'm sure the same applies to pangolins.
Sure, and the interesting thing with pangolins is unlike rhino, which essentially you can harvest the horn every 3 years or so, you can't harvest the scale of a pangolin. You have to kill the animal. It's pretty much the same as elephant. You can't harvest ivory and it'll grow back, unlike rhino horn. When you harvest pangolin, it's over for that particular animal. An interesting comment on that is that most of the Chinese public don't know what they're consuming when they're consuming a pharmacopoeia remedy, whether it's for a spiritual belief or whether it's for a medicinal belief. When we tell them what they're actually consuming, it's interesting how upset some of them do get, and how much affinity they do have for their wildlife. The people involved in the trade, the people doing the illegal trade, yes, that is correct. The rarer it gets, the more it's worth, the happier they are until they're all gone. But I think for the general public in Asia, they do have a huge affinity for their natural plants and animals.
Great. But I've just realized I missed an earlier question from Anthony. Ray, can you elaborate on what you said earlier about pangolins in northern Natal being ecologically extinct? Do they only pass through the region, or what's the case?
So man-made borders are drawn in by man. If you look at Zululand, it's essentially where the Zulu people occur, in particular the savanna regions of Zululand. So there are pangolins still in KwaZulu-Natal, in particular the savanna bushveld of Zululand. The population is so rare and infrequently seen on the ground. I think I've had 3 sightings over the last 11 years from Zululand. So although we're talking about a ghost of an animal, we do have a reasonable sighting record from particular provinces. So when an animal is classified as ecologically extinct, it doesn't mean in the true sense of the term extinct, because extinct means gone, every single one. There's nothing left. Ecologically extinct means there are some individuals, but the reproductive biology for the species is insignificant or doesn't exist. So the recruitment of young pangolins from natural reproduction in KwaZulu-Natal, in Zululand, is so infrequent that we consider the species ecologically extinct, if that makes more sense.
Makes sense to me. Okay. I think that we've run through all the questions. Ray, thank you very much for your time and answering all those questions. I think that a lot of people are going to go away tonight re-educated and thinking about these little animals. We had a very good attendance. I don't know what the Facebook was like, but we will tell you in a couple of days what it was like. But we really had great things. Oh, just a quick thing that's popped up. It says, "Hi Ray, your snap scan on your website is not working for donations." So somebody's trying to give you money and you're not getting it. So you better fix that. You better fix that tomorrow morning. Right.
Cheers, folks.
Okay.
We'll get to it straight away. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah. So once again, thank you very, very much for your time. From what you've said, I don't know where you find time to do all these things, but we are very grateful that you are saving these little creatures for us, so that one day when we're driving in the bush, we will see them. So from the honorary rangers and everybody who attended tonight, once again, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very clear and concise answers to all the questions.
And from my side, Peter, thanks very much, honorary rangers. You guys have always supported our cause, and I just want to say, well done for what the honorary rangers are doing. A huge amount of work that sometimes goes unnoticed, but we do notice it, and us at the African Pangolin Working Group know the various projects you're involved in, the fundraising initiatives, even if it's fixing up a toilet in a national park. But wonderful work, and humbling to witness. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Ray, thank you very much. And please, if you have a project that we can help you with, please let us know. We besides working in the national parks, we've got lots of people who are out in the bush at various times and would certainly, I'm sure, love to help you. And if you want me to tag along after one of these guys one day, I'll very happily come and join you, just so that I can walk along behind one and see what they do in the wild. So once again, thanks very much, and thank you to everybody who joined us. I haven't got to put our snap scan up just in case it doesn't work either, but you can see our website links there that you can go to help us, and please help Ray as well. I know everybody's having a tough time these days, but every cent helps something in conservation. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you really enjoyed it. Yep. I enjoyed it. My wife enjoyed it, and Ray will send you a couple of the thank you messages that did come up. So once again, thank you to everybody, and good night until